subconscious. And that became my book Patient Zero, which launched my thriller series, which is my second biggest selling series. You know, it's on sale in 32 countries, I think. Whereas my Rotten Ruin series, my teen series, is 45 languages has been translated into around the world. It's kind of a weird process of how that works. Sometimes you write something that you think is one thing and it becomes something else. And a good example of that, Rotten Ruin, I had been asked, there's a fantasy and horror writer named Christopher Golden, who also is an anthology editor. And he asked me to write a short story for an anthology he was editing called The New Dead, which were all stories by top horror writers who had some familiarity with zombies, but he wanted something that hadn't been done before, that each of us was writing that was a little new to us. And at that point, I had never written YA, had no interest in YA at the time, and had never written a post-apocalyptic story. So I decided I would write a post-apocalyptic story, not for young adults, but about a teenager. A couple teenagers looking for jobs in a town that's 14 years after the zombie apocalypse. And the story was published in the anthology, and a lot of reviewers pulled out that story and kept mentioning that story. And my agent, usually agents don't read your short fiction, she read the story and said, you know, that's the opening of a young adult novel. And I was like, no, it's not. Because the last young adult novel at that point I had read was To Kill a Mockingbird in the 7th grade, which, by the way, had also not been written as a young adult novel, though it is sold as such now. And so she said, just let me take it out, that story, take it out as the opening of a young adult novel and see if I can get any interest. So this was the first of a long line of arguments I've lost with my agent, because she knows the business better than I do. I said, you're going to make a fool of yourself. This is, you're going to make a fool of me. 3 days later, she had an auction going with 5 publishing houses, and Simon & Schuster came in as the high bidder for an absurd amount of money. Like, young adult fiction pays much more than adult fiction, and I didn't realize how much more until she said, this is what they're willing to offer. And my response was something like, and I may have said that for quite a long time. And then she said, but I think we can get more. So that's the point at which I just shut up, let her get more. And it's funny because when the editor bought it, usually there's haggling back and forth, and it's somewhat of a knife fight. And then when the editor buys it, he or she calls the writer to congratulate them and then also talk about the book. Because the editor always has ideas. And by this point, they'd only read the short story and an outline of the book. So he calls me up. I'm sitting at a Starbucks, because that's where I'm usually to be found. And he calls me up and said, I love the book. It's great. What's the rest of the story? And I said, well, you have the outline for the rest of the book. He said, no. What's the rest of the series? I had no intention that this was going to be a series. I didn't even believe it was going to be a book. And so I just started talking about what it might be. And I mean, totally on the spot. He's not saying, he didn't ask me to email him this later on. He wants me to tell him what the rest of the story is now. So I just, on the fly, told him a larger story. And when I'm done talking, he said, you know what? It's a little too much for 2 books. So let's do 4. And I'll get your agent on the line. We'll make the deal. And I can't wait to get started. He hangs up. So that number that I got was ×4 now. And I called my wife, and I'm pretty sure my voice was like 9 octaves higher than it normally is. And I told her what the amount was they're going to buy the series for. And she also hit the ultrasonics when her voice went up. And for days, we just kept saying the number and laughing because we just couldn't believe that was the number. And the books went on to become the Rotten Ruin series, which are big hits around the world. It's going to be it's now just been bought for Webtoons, Line Webtoons, which are comics for your phone, and we're about to close a deal with Alcon for a film version of it, for something that I didn't think was going to be YA anyway. Now, since then, I've become very familiar with the YA market. I've read a lot of YA, and I've written a lot more YA. I've written a dozen YA books now. Love the market, but I just didn't know. Yes. Well, the biggest surprise was how open it was, how thematically open it was. Because in adult fiction, if you write a mystery, it's a mystery. It can't have horror. Mystery horror is horror. It's not mystery horror. So they have these rigid lines in the adult. In YA, it's whatever the book is. So mine is a post-apocalyptic coming-of-age story that's also a thriller, also a chase story, and a love story, and this and that, and it's all these things, and it's just YA. The freedom to be able to go wherever the story wants to go was the biggest surprise, and also the dedication that the readers had for the book. I mean, we've sold, millions of copies of this book worldwide, and I go to visit different countries. Like I was in Tuscany a couple of years ago at the Lucca Comics and Games, which is this 500,000 person Comic Con in Tuscany, and they took me out to schools, local schools, and these kids had read the translation of it, and even though we were talking to each other through translators, we were all completely, pardon the pun, on the same page, all talking about zombies, zombie apocalypse, how to survive the zombie apocalypse, talking about favorite characters. It was a unifying thing with kids around the world, and it also, the second thing that really surprised me is, because I haven't, like my son's in his 30s now, I haven't been a parent of a kid that young in a long time, and I didn't really know any. So like a lot of adults, I had forgotten how smart kids are. I mean, like deeply smart. Because I remember being, me and my friends, we thought we were pretty smart as kids, but you always think that you're smart at whatever age you are. But now that I'm starting to meet kids around the world and talk to them, and I do these exercises where we try to solve survival problems in the zombie apocalypse, if I pit the teens against the adults, the teens slaughter the adults in common sense, practical, forward, imaginative thinking every single time. And when I ask the kids to recommend books that they love that maybe I should try, it isn't just favorite books. It's books that they've read and really get and can explain to you what the core is, to the point where they're explaining the subtext of it, even if they don't know the word subtext. They're explaining the deeper meaning of it. Kids are so much smarter than I thought, and that's a delight for me. So those are the two most surprising things, and they both make me very, very happy. So, yes?
I'm married to an aspiring writer.
Cool.
He is in the software industry, and we're very happy with that life. But he says, my next step is this.
Cool.
We saw you at another pod, and he was just like, I want to be the next.
Very weirdly flattering.
We're now grappling with all the great ideas scribbled on, and his brain then goes to, and then I'll be that. But he gets lost in the middle, the extremely important, those middle stages.
Oh, I definitely got some things I can help with that. First off, at the end of this, if you don't have my card, grab my card before you leave. Largely because everybody misspells my name when they're looking for my website. It's not M-A-Y Berry. It's spelled Maberry, pronounced Mayberry, Scottish spelling. But if you go to my website, there's a page of free stuff for writers, a whole bunch of downloadable PDFs. There's notes on the 3-act structure, which is how you plot. There's samples of a novel synopsis. There's novel format. There's all sorts of stuff. There's even a comic book script up there, so you can see what a comic book script looks like, so you can write those. And also, is he on Facebook?
No.
Are you on Facebook?
No.
Really?
I know, yeah.
Are you from Earth?
I know.
Okay.
Turkey a couple years ago.
Okay, well, when he goes, if he writes something and tries to sell it, he'd better have a positioning on social media, because agents will not represent someone, for the most part, who's not positioned on social media, because it's how we market our books. So I would suggest he get involved, even if he just creates a page to use only as a writer, even if it's wannabe writer, as a writer. He doesn't have to put a lot of family stuff up. In fact, probably shouldn't. Just talk about books he loves. Make sure he's not slamming books he hates, because people in the business will remember that. And friend other writers, friend librarians and booksellers and fans. But on social media, there's also the Writers Coffee House page, which is my group. Now, for those who are interested in writing, the Writers Coffee House, I started this 16 years ago back in Pennsylvania. We have 19 of them around the country right now. They are free 3-hour networking sessions for writers of any kind and of any level of experience, from absolute beginners to bestsellers. It's writers helping writers understand the craft and the business of writing. And our Facebook page allows you to go on there, talk to other writers, ask questions, get answers. It's really useful. Writers should always help other writers. And I'm actually going to pause to tell a really cool backstory of why I love helping other writers. So my backstory, I grew up in a very bad part of Philadelphia. My father, who I was not friends and close with, was a career criminal who also ran the local chapter of the KKK. So not a good guy by any stretch of the imagination. And I grew up in a neighborhood where I didn't meet a person of color until 7th grade. It was just white. And it was a really rough, violent area. I found out about issues of race and intolerance from the appearance of the Black Panther in the early issues of Fantastic Four comics. Because I was born in the 50s, raised in the 60s, so I remember when that character was introduced. In 7th grade, I took that comic, issue 119 of Fantastic Four, where T'Challa is arrested in the Marvel version of South Africa, and the Thing and the Torch go and help break him out. Now, even as a teenager, I was looking at that cover and thinking that how odd it was, because T'Challa's a black guy. The Thing, when he's in his Rocky form, is kind of orange-brown, and the Torch, when he's on fire, is red. So you have a red man, a brown man helping a black man. Even though the two characters were essentially white, they weren't white in the comic. And I thought there had to be some kind of a statement. My middle school librarian, who, as far as I'm concerned, is a superhero, for a couple of reasons. First thing she said is, well, that's a story about apartheid. And it's a word I'd never heard of before. And she said, you don't know about apartheid? She said, how about the Jim Crow laws? How about, civil rights movement? And, we were not allowed to have access to any of that information as kids. So because of that character's appearance in a comic book, I had my brain open up to the realities of pro and con of racial differences, the horrors of racial intolerance. My father was a Holocaust denier, so I learned about the Holocaust. So I learned a lot about the world as it was. And when your eyes are open, you have a choice. You can choose to say, okay, well, that's one interpretation of reality. I prefer my version, which was what my brother did, and he stayed closed-minded his whole life. Or you can say, that's the world as it really is. Let me take a closer look. And that's where I went. And my librarian was instrumental in that. Also, that librarian was the secretary for 2 different clubs of professional writers, one that met in Philadelphia and one that met in New York. And my grandmother forged my father's signature to allow me to go to the meetings. He thought I was in football practice. I have never touched a football. In my neighborhood, our sports were baseball and gang fights, so football not a thing. But I would go to these meetings. The Philadelphia club was the epic and heroic fantasy crowd. Sprague de Camp, Lynn Carter, if he was in town, Michael Moorcock, and a bunch of other writers. Fritz Lieber was there often when he was in town. So I got to meet a lot of people writing epic fantasy. And the New York crowd, however, since in this early 70s, 1970, 71, publishing was in New York. I mean, it still is, but it was even more so then. There was no internet. So if a writer was a major writer, he or she had to go to New York for, frequently for events. So the club of writers in New York that I was introduced to is Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Arthur C. Clarke, Avram Davidson, Gene Roddenberry, James Blish. I mean, it was an incredible group of writers. Now, I hadn't read a lot of fantasy and science fiction as a kid. So when my librarian introduced me to Ray Bradbury, and she's like, and this is Ray Bradbury. And I'm like, oh, are you a writer too? Not my greatest moment. And he had a very tolerant smile, and he's like, I've taken a swing at it once or twice. So over the next 3 years, which is, I was going up to these meetings, every time Matheson and Bradbury were in town, they took time to sit me down and talk to me about writing. And they realized I was serious. I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, even when I was a little kid, before I could read and write, I was telling stories with toys. I always wanted to be a writer. And they took time with me and explained not only the craft of writing, but the business of publishing, which are different things. And Bradbury gave me the 10 commandments of how to be a great writer. Don't be a jackass. Do not be a jackass. Really, don't be a jackass. And it goes on and on like that. That was his 10 commandments of how to be a great writer. Now, they had no reason to take time out to mentor me or guide me or answer my questions or anything else. There was no gain for them at all on this, but they did it anyway. And, their whole thing was, before the phrase pay it forward was even a phrase, they were saying, well, writers should help other writers. So if you're ever in a position where your career is doing well, help other writers, because it's more fun when there are more kids in the playground. I like that. So I started these writers' coffee houses because I wanted, you know, I had become successful. I grew up poor, became successful, and I love seeing other writers make their step. I hate when I see writers making the same mistakes over and over again because nobody's told them the realities of it. How, like, if you want to write a query letter for a book, I have a version on my website that's downloadable that's been tweaked by more than a dozen top agents in the business and 20 editors. It is the version of the query letter they want to see come across their desk. It's right there. Go download it. Copy that. I like, you know, and in 2008 and 2009, during the economic downturn, what you saw is two different camps emerge in the writing community. One camp seemed to think that if somebody asks you for advice, like maybe a lead or maybe a connection to an agent or something, if you give them that help, then they'll take a finite number of opportunities. They'll take your opportunity away from you, and they'll get it and you won't, as if there really is only a limited number of opportunities. And it's very fear-based thinking, and it's very potent fear-based thinking. The other camp, which is bigger but less vocal, and I wish they'd be more vocal, believes that if more writers help other writers, more good books will get written, which will increase the number of readers because there'll be more good books to read, and everyone in publishing, from writer to bookseller, everyone in publishing will prosper. It's positivity-based thinking. And another thing that Richard Matheson told me is don't ever let fear be part of your business plan. They also told me when I choose what to write, because all writers have more than one idea, always pick the book, two things. Bradbury said, Matheson said, always pick the book that's going to be the most fun to do. And then Bradbury said, don't just write the book you would read, write the book you would go out of your way to hunt down and read. Write that one. And those two philosophies work really well together. So I write the stuff that's most fun, and I write the books that I would absolutely go out of my way to get. And that was great advice from great writers. And also, later on in their lives, I got the last ever cover quotes from each of them for my first novels. And they came in a little late for the first printing, but they were on the 10th anniversary editions of the books. And it just made me, tear up a little bit, because one of the things, Bradbury said is, I knew him as a teenager. I expected great things, and he has done great things. And I'm like, I lost it. But they were great guys. And, writers should help other writers. So that was that. So long-winded answer to that question. Other questions? Yes? As an editor? Yeah, I edit anthologies. I'm doing my 15th anthology right now. Usually I have a mix of, stories in there by top pros who I invite, and also some voices that haven't been heard that probably should. I like allowing people to kind of get their step, and putting them in an anthology with some big names is a great way to do that, because people will buy it because it has an R.L. Stein, story in there, or a Shauna McGuire story. Who's a good friend of mine. She has a loyal fan base. They'll buy it because her name's on the cover. Heather Graham, or any of the other writers that I work with who have big fan bases. But there are stories in there by writers you haven't heard of. Sometimes it's their first published work, and it has to be a good story, of course. So you may have to edit them a little more heavily than you would an R.L. Stein, but that edit, if you work with them correctly, they don't see the edit as criticism in a negative way. They see it as a useful critique to how to be as good as they can possibly be at this stage of their career. And several of the people who have been in those anthologies have gone on then to publish more and more work, because editors take note, readers take note, and the story then gets to speak for itself in an anthology that's getting attention because of the bigger names. I also used to teach a lot of writing. I've taught writing programs for years. I had one when I lived in Pennsylvania. I taught a program called Experimental Writing for Teens, which each couple of weeks, the group of teenagers, I would introduce them to a different genre, give them some idea about the genre, and have writing assignments they'd have to do in class and read in class that were set in that genre. Like we do steampunk, we might do romance, we might do historical fiction, science fiction, jump all around. And of that group, about 6 of the kids have gone on to publish novels, and about 12 have gone on to publish short fiction. 3 have gone into publishing as assistant or associate editors, which is great. You know, teaching them not only the craft, but the business part of it. Because you have to know the business or you're not going to be successful. No matter how good you are as a writer, if you don't understand the business, you're not going to get anywhere. But the business is learnable, you know. And also teaching them not to take things personally, because I generally don't take anything personally. So if somebody has a critique of something that you've done, that's their opinion. Okay, fine. You know, nobody's opinion is absolute. I mean, if that was the case, everybody who loves books would buy every book that's published, and we don't. I mean, I have books by close friends that I don't read because they're not my type, not my style of book. Doesn't mean the book's bad. And I have friends who have written books that I don't like. Doesn't mean that they should stop writing. It's just they're not the writer that had they been total strangers, I would probably not have read any more of their work. And the same is, you know, not everyone who I know reads all my stuff either. I write too damn much for one thing. But encouragement is really important. Like also with writers groups, there are a lot of people who get involved in a writer's critique group. And I loathe these for the most part. Not always, but for the most part. The ones that get it right do it well. If they give a critique, they also have to give a suggestion. So if they say, I don't like this character, but maybe try this, and it's a suggestion, not a command. You know, in any of the critique groups I have put together, you cannot say something negative without giving a positive potential action step. But a lot of these groups have at least one person in there who knowingly or subconsciously is trying to make sure that nobody succeeds because they know they never will. There's this passive-aggressive thing that happens in a lot of these critique groups. And I know people who have been in critique groups with novels going on 10 years. It's too long, you know. The book probably should have gone out years ago. Even if it's going to get rejected, at least it's getting rejected by editors who then might give you some feedback of use. But a lot of these critique groups feed on each other, and that's not fair. It's not useful. So, other questions? Because remember, there's a prize to the best questions. For those who don't know this, the prize. My favorite question for today, that person will get to be either in my next Joe Ledger book or the next Rotten Ruin book. I do not promise that things will end well for the character. I'm just saying. You had a question, yes?
Is there another option instead of a critique group?
Well, no, you can do a critique group. I would just say make sure that you set the rules first. Start one where you get a couple people and set the rules. And that rule being you can't put negative unless you also suggest positive. But also it's a good idea to bring in somebody like no matter where you live, there's going to be at least one professional writer, probably an editor or two, maybe an agent or two. Just ask them, even if you have to pay them one time, to come in and teach the group how to critique. Because that's easy to do. And you could learn how to critique in one session. And then you have a guideline for the rest of your group's meetings that'll actually get each other somewhere. You know, you'll help rather than crush. And a lot of people come out of these critique groups with an eroded self-confidence that gets worse and worse every month. But because they're the only writers they talk to, they think they have to go. And they lose faith in their writing, so they feel they have to go back to get more critique, even though that critique is as corrosive each time. So you have to teach how to do it. And it's easy to learn. You know, when I started my first critique group, I was not yet a published novelist, though I had been publishing nonfiction. So when I started that group, I actually brought in a local writer to explain how to do critique. And I also, in another session, brought in a professor of literature to explain thematic critique, which is really important. And one of the reasons I had the writer in there is because a lot of people in critique groups critique the book as if it's a finished, polished, final draft. Almost everyone there is either at a first or a low or an early draft. So picking apart the figurative and descriptive language of a first draft is stupid. You know, what does that matter to a first draft? Does the story make sense? Does it move? Does it have engaging characters? That's all we need to know about a first draft. Does the plot have relevance, you know, to the characters' lives? But picking apart the polish is ridiculous. It's like going to a mechanic, you know, with a problem with your car, and he's telling you that it isn't shined well enough. You know, you haven't polished the fenders. What does that have to do with the engine noise? So it's easy to fix if you do it right, but you have to be involved in setting it up right from the beginning. Any other questions before yes?
Is there an idea that you have used within or not within one of your published books that you regret?
Huh. I don't think there's anything I regret. I mean, there are some sophomore problems in my first book, even though that book is very successful, that I would like to, I wish I could go back and fix. Like, when I was writing my first novel, and it was a long novel, it took me 3.5 years to write that book. It was, I was teaching myself how to write. In 3.5 years, you forget a lot about what you've written in earlier pages. So there are times where I'll introduce a character like kind of twice, because it may have been 9 months since I had that character in a scene, but it's not 9 months since the person read those other pages. So now I trust that the reader will remember more. But thematically, I don't have anything I regret, really. There are things that resonate or don't resonate with some readers. There are characters that I've killed off, for example, that I still get hate mail about, but I don't regret killing them off. They died because it was appropriate to the story I was telling, not because, I never kill a character off as a stunt. I had this discussion with George R.R. Martin once. We were at StokerCon on the Queen Mary 2, and we were talking at the bar. Writers drink occasionally. He was saying that people criticize him for stunt murders in his books. And he doesn't. He actually plans out the deaths of characters, because part of the theme of Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire, is that no one is safe. There is no hero who is the enduring hero of any tale, because if you look at history, people die all the time. And he wanted every life, no matter how important to the story, to be as fragile as that. So there isn't stunt murders. The people think there are, and they're not. Walking Dead is guilty of stunt murders. They have a slow episode. They kill somebody off because the ratings have slipped last week. And I'm friends with the guy who created Walking Dead, Bob Kirkman. He admits that they do that too. But that's 8 years into a TV series now, so they're going to kind of have to do that. But when I kill characters, I'm not doing it as a stunt. I have a lot of harsh stuff happening to my characters. There's child abuse in a couple stories because I was exploring that. What I never do is put something like that in there gratuitously, nor do I put it in there too explicitly. Like if there's I don't know if I've written, there's one rape scene in one of my stories, but it's referred to. I don't write the rape scene and describe the rape, because that's gratuitous. And when I read something where somebody is really being descriptive about a rape, or watching a movie where you're seeing the rape happen on film, there's kind of no reason for that. I wonder about the motivation of the people who wrote that script and shot it. Like, there was a movie called Irreversible that has a really brutal, like, 10-minute rape scene in it. There's absolutely no reason for that scene to be more than a couple of seconds long. It's clearly playing to the audience that enjoys rape scenes, because it was, you have to question the motivations. So I don't put gratuitous scenes in there. Violence is in a lot of my stories because I write stories about people who are dealing with violence. But the subtext of all of it is violence always leaves a mark. How do we deal with that? So I don't regret a lot of stuff in my stories. And anything that I wish I had put in the book, I'll put it in some other book. And that's one of the reasons I love writing, because if I feel like there's something I wanted to do and I didn't do it, I know I've got another book to do it in, or a short story or a comic, and I'll explore it in that. But no, I don't have a lot of regrets. Also, when you're doing something for publication, you're going to read it, your agent's going to read it, your editor's going to read it, a copy editor and a proofreader are going to read it. You'll get notes, and if there are things that are questionable, that either should be or should not be in there, somebody at some point is going to call you on it, and you may get notes to address that. And for example, in the Rotten Ruins series, there was something I took out. There are things I regret having to edit out that I was kind of forced into editing out. There's two examples of that. In the Rotten Ruins series, it takes place 14 years after the zombie apocalypse, and there's a group of very corrupt adults who have this thing called Game Land, where they kidnap children and they make them fight in these pits against zombies, and people bet on it. There was also an allusion to sexual abuse of children. Now, I was an abused child. My sisters were sexually abused. I wanted to explore the dynamic and the damage of that in the book. But because it was YA, the editor at Simon & Schuster said that was something they didn't want to put in there, and they asked me to take that out, which I did. I don't think I should have, but I did. I later explored it to a degree in a graphic novel that was set between books 2 and 3 of the Rotten Ruin series, and I did explore it in that. So I got to at least explore that, but again, in a way that was not gratuitous. The one thing and this is probably my only real regret, I was doing a comic for Marvel. It was a Punisher comic, post-apocalyptic Punisher comic called, it was originally called Last Gun on Earth, but it was published as Marvel Universe versus the Punisher. In my original story, the Punisher starts off present day. He's fighting a group of Russian mafia types who are bringing in what he thinks is a suitcase nuke. And during the gunfight, the case is shot and breaks open. It turns out it's not a nuke in there. It's a bioweapon which gets into the water system, goes through drains, gets into the water system. 5 years later, the bioweapon has, mutated, and it's all over the world now. And people begin turning into like cannibal, like almost like Neanderthal cannibal types. So it's not like a zombie thing. They become savage cannibals. And we jump 5 years forward again, and it turns out that's the whole world. The Punisher, because he was bathed, all the stuff hit him at once, all the bioweapon, the superdose gave him an immunity. He's the only immune person, and everyone else is a monster. So we go forward into the Punisher's world, where he's just hunting down all of these superheroes who now are these tribes, cannibal tribes, and killing them all. And in the story, he's dealing with the fact that he is responsible for the end of the world. But at the same time, if you know the Punisher's character from the comics, he's nuts. He thinks that any criminal should be killed, and he's the executioner. It's totally black or white. Well, now the world is him versus monsters. He can kill anyone he wants. It's become simplified, and he's gone. His madness has been kind of verified that that's the way the world is. And then he starts finding human survivors, uninfected human survivors, and he has to start caring about people, and he has to try to save as many as he can so that he can kind of redeem himself. In the original script, at the end of that story, he's rescued, several thousand humans, and enough that they can restart the world. There's enough people for a deep gene pool to restart the world. And they've escaped New York City. And the next to the last page, they're all sitting around a campfire, and they're talking and laughing, and they're happy to be survivors. He's sitting just slightly apart, drinking coffee, a little bit of a smile, thinking maybe he's redeemed himself. Cut to the next page, he's sitting there drinking his coffee, smiling, and there's no one around the campfire. He's only imagined there were survivors. He's totally nuts. He's completely nuts. And that's what they bought. And then Disney bought Marvel. And even though I turned in the script, Disney, and I had actually written the first 2 issues of it, Disney said, we can't do that ending. You can't make the Punisher nuts. And I'm like, well, first off, the Punisher actually is nuts. By any metric of psychological behavior, he's completely out of his mind. And they said, well, you can't do that. And you also can't change the Punisher's personality so that he's, And I said, it's a post-apocalyptic what-if story. Of course I can. I mean, Marvel's had a history of writing these types of what-if stories. And they said, but you can't do it. We'd rather cancel the book than have you do that ending. And I should have let them cancel it. I should have. But I was still young in my career at Marvel, and I said, all right, I'll give you a different ending. I still wrote a pretty brutal ending. He winds up shooting Spider-Man. But it wasn't the ending I wanted to write, and I think that ending would have been a powerful story, because, but they dangled something in front of me that at the time I regret taking, was they said, well, yeah, but if you change it, we can do more comics. You can do more sequels to it. And I wound up doing an Avengers one and a Wolverine one. And it made a lot of money, and it hit bestseller lists and all that. But man, I should have stuck to my guns. I regret that. That's my only regret in the writing business. It's that. Other questions? Yes. Well, yes, I change my password on all social media and on my laptop every week. I email everything to myself. Like every day's writing, I will email. I have an account that's just for It's just a dump of my files, and I'll email it to myself. That way, it's in my outgoing and my inbox, so it's always there. Every time I write, the file is already time-coded, so I know I can prove when I had that file. So if I email it to myself, I can prove that I own a version of it before someone else has it. And your hard drive is admissible as evidence, and that auto timestamps everything anyway. Plagiarism is not as big a problem nowadays as it used to be. It's still there, but it's not as big a problem. And part of it is, because computers are, they timestamp everything. Also, every time I send an email to myself with that day's writing, it's also copied to my assistant. So she has a copy of it too. I take precautions. I don't ever end a day without sending out what I've written that day via email to myself and my assistant. And I do now have an assistant, which is very weird to even say that I have an assistant, because 13 years ago, when my first novel came out, and it was nominated for a Stoker Award, I had to borrow money to go to the awards ceremony, because I still wasn't making enough money as a writer. A lot has happened in 13 years. Now I have a full-time assistant who, I pay her full-time, she gets benefits, even dental, And I couldn't have afforded that for myself 13 years ago. So it's kind of cool. And I have really great agents. I have a literary agent who I've been with from my first fiction piece. Time's up? Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, good. I've had an agent for my first fiction piece all the way through my career. And she's amazing. And her career has grown up with mine. I was her first client. Our careers have grown up together. And I have a film agent. There's a type of agent in Hollywood that's book to film. That's what they do. They just sell published IPs to Hollywood. And she's with CAA, which is the big dog in Hollywood. And it's great because, she sold the V-Wars series. My Joe Ledger series is with Sony in development for cable TV. Mars One is in development for film. The Rotten Ruin series is a webtoon. It's going to be a webtoon later this year. It's being produced right now, and it's going to be a film. And my novel Glimpse, which is kind of weird, is being optioned because a notable actor, this is Sparta, you might get an idea who that is, wants to play a supporting character in the book, but wants to do a movie maybe based on him. So a lot of weird stuff's happening. And it's all been happening like in the last few years. So it's weird out there. But everything is protected. And in Hollywood, IPs are really important. I'll have meetings where I'll be invited up to a film studio where they will just sit there and ask me what IPs I have available and to pitch them on the spot to them. And that's kind of weird. You got to be comfortable with pitching too, which I am very comfortable pitching. I was up at Alcon, the company that's done everything from the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants to The Expanse to Blade Runner 2049. And the vice president invited me up to what was supposed to be a 40-minute meeting turned into a 3.5-hour meeting where he just kept saying, well, what else you got? And I kept throwing ideas at him, and he's like making notes. And a couple of weeks later, he calls me up having finished the first Rotten Ruin book, and he said, so I think we need to have a talk with your agent. I think we need to make a movie. So that happened. It's a weird biz. I know some of the Hollywood stuff is the direct result of V-Wars. Once you have something, then you get hot. Like I had a lot of things where I was trying to get traction on, but then V-Wars, is actually in post-production now. It's going to be on Netflix this fall. Once you have a show, especially a Netflix show, then your other stuff starts looking good. In fact, one of my short stories was optioned for TV. They have a script writer and everything else. They're working on a pilot based on a short story. I've never heard of a short story option like that before. I mean, Stephen King gets his short stories optioned. And Elmore Leonard had the short story option that became the show Justified, but it's rare for a short story to become a show. And they're developing a show based on one of my short stories, a young adult short story. It's like, who knew? It's crazy. We have time for a couple more questions, if anybody has. Yes, first you and then you.
Thank you for the advice for my writer husband.
Your invisible writer husband, too.
I know, well, he's at that software job right now. Do you have any advice, or have you seen successful spouses or plus ones that, other than me attending panels and doing my taxes, other things?
Yeah, if you see if you see your spouse sitting at a computer and they're not typing, doesn't mean they're not writing. There are a lot, I mean, if it was just typing, I would do even more than 4,000 words a day. But a lot of it is staring into space. Ray Bradbury once said, writing is 99% thinking about it and the rest is typing. So when that writer is in the dedicated writing space, leave them alone. Also, encourage self-bribery. Now, the way that works, I set a word count. Now, I do 4,000 words a day. However, my word count is 2,500 words. So every day when I hit 2,500 words, I go to my online bank and put money in my vacation account. I still exceed that, but I don't set a word count that stretches me, because if something happens, I don't want to build in frustration or, you know, or self-loathing for not having done it. If I could only write 1,000 words a day, my word count would be probably 500 or 750, you know. But I started doing this when I was writing magazine features, when I was still in college. I would hit my word count, put a buck in a jar. At the end of the draft, the first draft, I can only use that money for fun, not for anything else. It had to be for fun. I still do that. And what happens is now my wife, knowing that the money is going into a vacation account, every day she will say, how's your word count going? She's all in favor of me getting that draft done. You know, I just wrote my first novel this year. It's already in the can. And she's already planning out where we're going. And that's fun. But if I'm sitting there, I don't, you know, they're not allowed to disturb me, because then they're disturbing the process of me writing something that could make money for the family. And also disturbing my happiness. You know, I don't disturb her when she's doing her happy stuff. But you have to respect what it looks like. It doesn't look, sometimes I'll be sitting there playing a video game. I play the world's easiest video games, like Solitaire and Snood. 2 games which, you know, even if you're brain dead, you can do. So I'll play those just to keep my hands busy while I'm thinking through something. Or I'll get up and I'll walk around, because I'm choreographing a fight scene or choreographing a placement of characters. And I may even be saying lines out loud. Just ignore me, leave me alone, I'm busy, I'm working. If I was fixing pipes, you wouldn't come into, you know, somebody's house where somebody's fixing a pipe and try to interrupt them, because that's not helping. So let them do their job and support that. And then ask them every day how it was. You don't have to get detailed, but just ask, you know, how was your writing today? And leave it at that. Support is not necessarily complicated, but it should be regular. And that matters too. Your question.
So a lot of your works incorporate emerging technologies, really cutting edge science. How do you stay on top of those developments and come up with ways they could be like abused by a lot of your villain characters?
Well, I read a lot of technical journals. I've subscribed to a lot of trade journals in science, history, politics, and so on. And I also now have a network of experts. If I want, and I found this out from my having learned to be a journalist first. If I want an expert, say, on gene editing, like the CRISPR gene technology, I'll look for news articles about CRISPR and then put the word expert in a Google search. And I'll see who's being interviewed as the expert. And then I'll go search for that person at whatever organization they're with. Could be a university or government, whatever. And then every single one of those places will have a contact page. And I'll contact them and ask if I can interview them. And almost always they say yes to writers. Also, things like, you know, if I want police stuff, I call the police department's PR line. They'll be happy to take you out for ride-alongs, invite you to autopsies, let you go to forensic collection stuff. Autopsies, by the way, you have to be really braced for that. Even before it was a bestseller, I was just asking if I could do the research, because they want you as experts to get your facts right. And they'll sometimes, you know, once you get to know them, something weird, new happens, they'll email you and say, oh, this is cool, you'll like this. You open the email, it's like melting flesh on somebody's face, and they're like, that's really cool. And I'm like, I'm glad I opened that when I'm not in public, you know. But that happens a lot, and as a result, you start getting really good contacts. I have seldom met an expert who wasn't eager to talk to writers. If you do that, though, if you're doing your research, I do recommend that you do it via email for the most part, because if you do phone interviews, you have to transcribe. You'll almost always get the technical spellings wrong. And people, when they're giving vocal interviews, sometimes something will occur to them and they'll interrupt themselves and talk about that and never come back to the other thing, which is a bit of a problem when you're trying to get the facts. So if you email, you get the bulk text. And always thank them in the acknowledgments page. But I have a lot of experts, like I knew about the Zika thing long before it was in the news, because the guys I'd interviewed for previous novels would email me and say, this Zika thing is going to hit the news. Here's the bottom line on it. So I was able to do a novel involving Zika before it was a big thing in the news. I was able to do I did a novel called Predator 1, where I talked about how commercial drones could be used for bad things before commercial drones were commercially available. I talked about autonomous drive systems being hacked and GPS hacking, again, before they were big things, and almost everything in that book came true, but it looked like I was predictive because I'm asking questions of experts who are thinking about this stuff, thinking about the things that can go wrong. Makes the writers look much smarter than we are, but also makes us look like we're savvy enough to make sure that we get experts who are on the cutting edge. And I think we're out of time. I am going to, no offense to anyone else, but my two favorite questions, spouse question was a great one, and the expert question actually was a great one, because I don't get asked that enough. And it's a really important thing for writers to know about experts. You other guys had great questions, so, you know, don't bitch at me. But those are my two favorites. So after this, talk to me, take my card, email me, and either you or someone else you nominate, as long as you do it with their permission, will be in one of my, either the next Your Ledger or the next Rotten Ruin book, but I do not promise that good things will happen to them. For example, do you know the comedian Tom Segura? He's got 3 or 4 Netflix specials. Well, he entered a contest once. I did a contest for how would you like to die in a zombie apocalypse? He entered it as a joke. And, you know, being a comedian, and I liked his idea so much, I killed him in my book, Fall of Night. And now, when he does stand-up, he often references that book because, hey, I died doing stand-up. This is great. But you got to make sure that the person is cool with being in the book, or yourselves. But we'll see what happens to you. Anyway, guys, thanks for coming out. I'm signing at Bard's Tower all weekend. If you guys want to stop by, either say hello, grab books, whatever. And if you want to meet Ian Somerhalder, the star of V-Wars, he's signing tomorrow in the autograph area. And you guys rock. Thanks so much. All right. Yay.